Today we are going to have a clash of the titans, and we're going to pit against the Sony Venice version 1 versus a brand new camera by RED, which is going to be the RED Raptor. Now, in today's video, we're going to compare some of the frame rates, some of the codecs, we're going to put an image side by side and find out what the pros and cons of each camera are. Now, the only caveat is I only have 24 hours with both these cameras, so we're going to get through everything that we can, but let's just get started with the video. Alright, so we're going to get through some of the obvious things between the RED Raptor and the Sony Venice. Now, obviously, these are drastically different cameras in terms of their size. The RED Raptor I could put into one hand, and the Sony Venice, it'd be hard-pressed for me to hold this for one hand for a really long time. Now, you're going to have multiple SDI ports, you're going to have things like monitor out, you're going to have your HDMI there that's going to be there as well, and as well, you can actually pick up this little extension unit on the back, which is a way that you're actually going to get raw on this camera, where the RED Raptor has it internally. Now, the RED Raptor does have a lot of things that are going for it. However, on a professional setup like a high-end commercial or something like a film set, you might want to have a little bit more security in terms of the memory options. Now, because this camera was made in 2022, the RED Raptor does use CF Express Type B cards. However, the Sony Venice does have proprietary memory in the SXX and the AXSM cards, and you could have SD cards there as well. However, there's a total of 5 different places that you could store memory on the Sony Venice internally, as well as you could externally record on things like a Ninja 5 or a Shogun. Where on the flip side, the RED Raptor only has one card slot, which doesn't inspire the most amount of confidence for me, especially if I need a backup when these files are going to be gigantic, and also if I'm going to be using a RED Raptor, I'm probably getting paid a lot of money. Now, the Sony Venice is obviously going to have the ability to use an E-mount, but you can get a PL mount adapter as well for this camera to use PL lenses. Now, on the RED Raptor side of things, you are going to have a native RF mount that's going to go on here. So you can use RF, EF if you have the adapter, or you could use PL as well. Now, we're going to talk about the RED Raptor XL a little bit later, but it does give you the ability to have a native PL mount instead, and it's also going to give you the ability to have built-in ND filters. Now, the RED Raptor on its own doesn't have built-in ND, so you're going to have to use that through a matte box or an adapter on the back of your camera. However, the Sony Venice has 9 stops of ND that you can use to adjust your exposure when you're on the fly. Now, in terms of the menus, the RED Raptor and the Sony Venice are actually pretty easy to use. Now, I might be a little bit biased because on the Sony Venice, I'm used to using Sony menus, but they are easy to use on this camera because you do have it double-sided on the camera itself, which makes it good if you have someone who's an assistant for you. On the flip side, the RED Raptor has a single screen for your menu settings. However, it is really easy to use and it's pretty straightforward as well. Now, in terms of audio between these two cameras, the Venice is going to pull away with it. Not only can you get an XLR module to give you 2 sources of XLR input, but at the same time, it does have an XLR port built in. Now, before we actually get this thing started and we start getting some test footage, let's actually see what the boot up time is between these two cameras. Boots up first. Ready and go. Well, the Venice is on. And the Venice is ready to go. And we're still waiting for the RED Raptor. Still waiting. Yep, I don't know how many seconds is that, but I'm pretty sure the Sony Venice won. Also, just as an aside, if you're at the level where you're using a Venice or a Raptor on a professional set, your 45 seconds of boot up time probably doesn't matter that much. You're more than likely going to be shooting there for 10 or 12 hours, and 40 seconds isn't going to change a lot of things. But we're going to keep moving on. We're going to rig these cameras up, and we're actually going to start doing some comparisons. Now, you might be wondering about what the maximum resolution is between these two cameras. Now, in terms of the image quality and resolution, the Sony Venice has the ability to use open gate 6K at up to 60 frames a second, where on the flip side, the RED Raptor has the ability to use 8K at 120 frames a second. Now, that actually is a lot more on the RED Raptor side of things. However, there is one caveat. Now, if you are going to use the RED Raptor and you want to use lower resolutions like 6K, 4K, or even 2K, what's going to end up happening is it's going to crop in farther and farther on the sensor. And since we all treat crop factor like it's the devil, that might not be the best situation for some people. However, when you're shooting on the Sony Venice, being able to shoot at 6K open gate, not only are you going to be able to reframe for a 16:9 or whatever frame rate you want, but you're also going to be able to use a full sensor in any of the shooting modes that you have. Now, between the Sony Venice and the RED Raptor, the Sony Venice still operates on a dual base ISO, where you're going to have 500 and 2500 as your two bases, whereas the RED Raptor, actually ISO technically doesn't exist. Because it's using R3D RAW, you could actually change your exposure, you could change your ISO to whatever you want to do in post, kind of making what you actually captured it on a little bit irrelevant. And I actually want to test this out by putting a side-by-side at 500 ISO on my Venice and 500 ISO on the RED Raptor, and adjusting for 2500 and putting them side by side. Now in the RED Raptor's case, comparing its ISO 500 and 2500, it actually looks exactly the same. But then comparing the Sony Venice to the RED Raptor at the higher base ISO, there actually is a little bit more noise in the Sony Venice. You're going to notice a little bit of artifacting in the darker areas of your image. Unfortunately, the Sony Venice doesn't have that R3D RAW, so you can't really control the raw data off the sensor, and you are going to introduce a little bit of noise. However, you could always just use some noise reduction and clean that right up. Now, next test, we're going to go over to the gym, and I'm going to film my buddy's workout. Now, this isn't necessarily the best situation to want to test out the RED Raptor and the Sony Venice. Both are incredibly expensive cameras, and you probably have some set design and a lot more things going into your production. However, I did want to test out some of the frame rates. Essentially what I wanted to do was test out the 120 frames a second on the RED Raptor and the 60 frames on the Sony Venice. Now I'm gonna admit, I watch a ton of footage, and comparing 8K to 6K, it's all pretty sharp, and being able to zoom in with that extra resolution is going to be just fine. Now in terms of 120 frames a second versus 60 frames a second, all that's gonna kind of be up to you. Generally speaking, for me, I use 60 frames a second a lot more. However, the RED Raptor has the ability to do that, and also can do it in 8K as well. Now because I'm someone that shoots a lot of sports and a lot of fitness, I decided to do a rolling shutter test. Now, the only way I know how to do a rolling shutter test, at least in the confines of this video, is to, I don't know, swing my camera back and forth and see what happens. And both looked pretty much the same. I don't really notice a gigantic difference in the rolling shutter when I'm swinging my camera around like an idiot. Now, you guys might notice a slight difference between the two of them, but both perform just fine. Now the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna talk about dynamic range, and I'm gonna kind of give the Venice a little bit of a pass here, only because it's a camera that is 6 years older than the RED Raptor. I did deliberately underexpose some footage, and I also overexposed some footage as well in two separate scenarios. And what's gonna end up happening is when you compare the RED Raptor to the Sony Venice when trying to bring up some of the darker areas and get that detail back, the RED Raptor actually is the clear winner here. Mostly because when you are trying to bring that information up, even if the information isn't there, the noise isn't as pronounced as on the Sony Venice. Now that might be another thing for the R3D RAW. Because you're going to be using raw data off of the sensor, it seems like it performs a little bit better using it that way than it does on the Sony Venice that's using a dual base ISO. Now in terms of recovering highlights, the RED Raptor actually outperforms the Sony Venice again. You actually get a little bit more highlight detail without it looking super awkward and blotchy, especially in the back of the window in this scene. Again, I think that has to do with the fact that it's 8K and you're getting that true raw that's going to be in there. And I could always just go into post, and I could also underexpose my image by changing the ISO, and it does recover a lot more information than if I go and change my exposure on the Sony Venice footage. Now, again, I'm gonna say the Sony Venice is a lot older than the RED Raptor, so this is kind of expected in terms of dynamic range, and RED also does have a patent on all the footage coming raw off of the sensor, so it's kind of an unfair advantage here. Now, this is a non-scientific test, and if you haven't noticed by now, you might have had me confused with someone who knows what they're doing. Now, what I will say is that likely situations which you're going to be using either one of these cameras is more than likely you're probably gonna have a ton of lights, and you're also gonna have a team with you. If you're gonna expose through the windows to make sure that your highlights aren't blown out, you're probably gonna add in enough light to make sure that your subject and the room itself is exposed. A lot of times where I'm at with dynamic range is, does it functionally look good in whatever situation I'm going to put it in? That doesn't necessarily mean how much latitude I'm gonna have from each one, but if I decide to do something like go outside, stand on top of a rooftop before sunset, can I expose through the sky and also get some detail in my subject at the same time? And the answer for this one is actually, well, it's yes. Now, at the end of the day, which one of these two cameras should you buy? Neither, because they're ungodly expensive, and even myself, who can't afford it or doesn't even have the time to master them, because this video is probably a disaster, I don't recommend somebody on a cinema camera like the Sony FX6 to try to make a decision whether the RED Raptor or the Sony Venice is going to be your next purchase. And if you are somebody that's going to be in that market, you're probably not watching YouTube anyways. However, there is going to be a price difference between these two camera packages. Now, the Sony Venice is going to cost a whopping $6,000 to be able to have the kit that could shoot in RAW with the recorder that's going to come attached. And the RED Raptor is actually going to be a lot cheaper than it. Now, keep in mind, there are going to be a couple things in terms of a workflow that you're going to be missing between these two cameras. Like we mentioned before earlier on in this video, the Sony Venice actually has multiple ways that you could store data, which is going to give you a lot more security and assurance, especially when you're on a really important job. And the RED Raptor only has one CF Express Type B slot. Now, for a lot of people might argue that that's all that you need because the CF Express format is actually robust and it's really secure. However, I would rather not have something bad happen if it does happen, and if it does, you only have one shot at it. Now on the flip side, we also talked about the built-in NDs that are going to be on the Sony Venice, and the RED Raptor doesn't have it, but the RED Raptor is also a lot cheaper. However, you can pick up something called the RED Raptor XL. It's going to make the camera significantly bigger and probably a lot closer to the size of the Sony Venice, but you're also going to get a built-in ND and a native REPL mount that's going to go on your camera. However, if you do decide to go with the Raptor XL, you're actually getting really close to the price of the Sony Venice anyways. So if I was to make a buying decision with $50,000-$60,000, I think in that realm you're actually going to make the bid to more security than outright video features. If I'm somebody that's going to be shooting a Hollywood movie or a super high-end budget commercial, my personal taste would be more to getting the security and the robustness of the Sony Venice, even though it might have a couple of qualities that aren't as good as the RED Raptor. However, if you are somebody that's going to be shooting commercial sets and you do need that frame rate and you do need that resolution, the RED Raptor is a shoe, and it objectively does better than the Sony Venice. In fact, I actually got some BTS in studio of using the RED Raptor on a food commercial. Now, it wasn't my set, but I got to see the RED Raptor in action, much better than me shooting a bunch of stuff at gyms and studios. That all to be said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, or at the very least you learned at least like one thing. Not my best camera comparison in the world, however, I did have a lot of fun using the RED Raptor versus the Sony Venice. That being said, if you guys want to see another video, I probably left it somewhere over there. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.